Good morning, everybody. We'll give folks just a minute to get logged in. And good morning, everyone. We still have folks clearing into the event from the waiting room, so we'll just give it another second for folks to get logged in. All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank you for joining us for this morning's special joint presentation by our Water Resources Committee and our Energy and Sustainable Development Committee. My name is Jason Palich, and I have the honor of serving as Executive Director of the partnership. In just a moment, I'll be turning things over to our board co-chair, Kristen Last, to introduce our featured speaker. But first, I'm going to go over some housekeeping items briefly. All attendees are muted during today's session. Following Secretary Theoharides' presentation, we will invite you to ask questions of the Secretary by typing them into the Q&A function of our Zoom meeting today. I will monitor the questions submitted and read them aloud to the Secretary. Please note that questions which are redundant, overly long, or disrespectful, which will not be asked, and I'll pause here to emphasize the need to keep questions as brief as possible. We understand the Secretary is presenting this morning on subject matter that is complex, and questions can't always be condensed succinctly. However, we do ask you to keep in mind that this is a live broadcast, and of course, for timing reasons, we will not be able to get to questions which are overly lengthy. A good rule of thumb is that a question should be closer to a sentence than a paragraph. At a pre-pandemic 495 MetroWest Partnership Committee meeting, we'd begin with our participants and attendees going around the room to introduce themselves. In keeping with that spirit, at this time, we invite you to utilize the chat function to introduce yourself by typing in your name, title, and organization so folks can get a sense of who's with us this morning. Should you experience technical difficulties during the session, our immediate guidance is to log out and then try logging back in. Should you need further assistance, the partnership's Manager of Policy and Planning, Jeremy Thompson, is available to assist you and can be reached via email at jeremy@495partnership.org. Please note that today's session is being recorded and will be posted to our website for later broadcast. At this time, I'm going to turn things over to Kristen Last, who is Shrewsbury's Assistant Town Manager and also serves as co-chair of the 495 MetroWest Partnership's Board of Directors, to introduce our featured speaker. Take it away, Kristen.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to help present this exciting opportunity to our members and our guests. Jason adequately introduced myself, but again, I will just state I'm Kristen Last, the Assistant Town Manager with the Town of Shrewsbury. I've been with the town for over 10 years now, and it's my pleasure to announce that we have with us today the Secretary of Energy and Environmental Affairs, Katie Theoharides, who will present on an act creating a next generation roadmap for Massachusetts climate policy, major climate legislation signed into law earlier this year by Governor Baker. Since 2019, the Secretary has overseen the Commonwealth's energy and environmental agencies tasked with protecting, preserving, and enhancing the Commonwealth's environmental resources while ensuring a clean energy future for the state's residents. The Secretary is trained as a field biologist, receiving a BA in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology from Dartmouth College, and a Master's of Science in Ecology and Environmental Biology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She joined the Baker-Polito administration in 2016 as the Director of Climate and Global Warming Solutions in the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, and then was later promoted to Undersecretary, leading the Commonwealth's nation-leading efforts on climate change. We know that each of our coalition partners in the 495 MetroWest Partnership will be touched by new climate legislation in some ways. And further, we know that the climate resiliency has become a priority of our municipalities and our business community. So we're ever grateful and thankful for the Secretary for taking time today to speak with us. And we look forward to hearing her presentation and working with her in the future. So I'd like to welcome and pretend that we're clapping in the room for her, Secretary Theoharides. So welcome and thank you for joining us this morning.
Well, thank you so much for the very kind introduction, Kristen, and thank you for the invitation to speak with you all today. Just looking through the names, I see so many partners that we've worked with either through our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program or Green Communities Program, or many of the other sort of signature programs of the Baker-Polito administration. So real pleasure to be here. I should also mention I was a resident of Westboro and then Grafton for a while. So love the MetroWest area. I am, Jeremy, do you want to get the slides up and I can get started with the presentation? So it is a really exciting time for us here in Massachusetts as we make significant progress taking action on climate change and creating a clean energy future. And it's also a real opportunity to start meeting our environmental goals and at the same time stimulating economic development with many of the policies and programs that we are implementing. Move to slide 2, please. So back in January of 2020, to set us on the right course towards meeting the scope of climate goals that are needed, Governor Baker set an aggressive target for Massachusetts to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. This target is consistent with where the science says we need to be, but there's no doubt it's an ambitious target and we'll need all of the tools in the toolbox to get there. What this graph shows, the dotted line is a reduction in what we're emitting in the state of Massachusetts. So we're looking to bring that down to reduce emissions at least 85%. At the same time, what net zero requires is that any remaining emissions are sequestered in our open space, in our working lands, in our forests, using technology if that becomes a viable option. And so we have to sequester at least 15% based on reducing the rest of the emissions down to zero. To get to this target, we have been engaged at the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs in a comprehensive science-based 2050 decarbonization roadmap process to map out the pathways available to achieve this goal. And I should mention, this goal puts us in a small group of other states across the nation that have set something as ambitious as net zero. It's also where the feds are at this point. Now, back in March, Governor Baker strengthened the Commonwealth's commitment to achieving this ambitious goal when he signed comprehensive climate legislation that gives Massachusetts the most ambitious emissions goal in the Commonwealth in the next 10, 20, and 30 years. And so I'll talk more about that legislation in particular today. Next slide, please. The administration and legislature have had a long-standing bipartisan record of partnership that has really helped us to make great progress here in Massachusetts in our efforts to take on this generational challenge, climate change. And I do really think it's a model for how folks at the federal level could go about passing important climate change and environmental laws. So thanks to that partnership, Massachusetts has once again really added to our national track record on this and taken another significant step to reduce emissions, protect our most vulnerable communities, and achieve these bold, ambitious goals of net zero by 2050 through signing Senate Bill 9. On March 26th, the governor signed this bill into law. And the bill does a number of really important things. A couple of highlights. It codifies into law the limit we set back in January 2020 of net zero. So that is now in law. It increases our authorization to select another 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind. I'll talk a lot more about this in a few minutes. It will make our appliances more energy efficient and allow municipalities to opt into highly energy efficient stretch code for newly constructed buildings, both things that will help us take back our nation-leading energy efficiency ranking. We slipped to 2 last year, and one of the key things that was highlighted in the scoring was that we did not have the latest standard for energy efficiency for appliances. It also includes new nation-leading provisions that will help us protect environmental justice communities that have historically been overburdened by pollution and underserved by the environmental planning process. And so for the first time, this legislation will require our Department of Environmental Protection to develop regulations to assess the cumulative impacts as part of our permitting process for certain projects. Next slide, please. The legislation set ambitious legal emission limits to ensure the Commonwealth continues to significantly reduce its emissions to the levels scientists say we need to get to. And so, as I mentioned, it codifies the net zero target for 2050, and it also authorizes our Secretariat to establish an emissions limit of no less than 50% for 2030 and no less than 75% for 2040. The legislation also authorizes EEA to establish emission limits every 5 years and sublimits for at least 6 sectors of the economy, including electric power, transportation, commercial and industrial heating and cooling, residential heating and cooling, industrial processes, and the natural gas distribution service. Next slide, please. On offshore wind, the last few months have obviously been a momentous time for clean energy and offshore wind in Massachusetts. And just last week, the Federal Bureau of Ocean Energy Management issued a record of decision that we have been long awaiting here in the Baker-Polito administration. This record of decision is the final approval from the feds to grant approval for our Vineyard Wind 800 megawatt offshore wind project, the first utility scale wind project offshore in the country. This key federal permitting approval allows Vineyard Wind to advance its construction and operations plan to bring this 800 megawatts of cost-effective renewable offshore power to Massachusetts ratepayers. It's enough energy to power 400,000 homes. And we've also been able to move to these super big General Electric turbines. They're 12 megawatts each, about 840 feet off the ground out in the ocean. And so we've shrunken the size, the footprint of the wind farm, actually because of the delays, allowed us to access this new technology. 2 weeks ago, our utilities issued a request for proposals for the third round of our 83C offshore wind energy solicitation. That refers to the section of the legislation from 2016 that allows us to procure this wind. And so we have a second contract that's moving through the permitting process now with Mayflower Wind, came in at an even lower price than Vineyard Wind. And now we've gone out for our third solicitation in this round of offshore wind development. And there are some key changes to this solicitation that I should highlight. The draft RFP proposes to allow bids anywhere from 200 megawatts up to 1,600 megawatts of offshore wind, which is consistent with the Department of Energy Resources recommendation last year following its investigation into offshore wind transmission, which found that larger procurements are more efficient and have some economies of scale that we're looking to encourage through this round of solicitation. The rounds 1 and 2 only allowed bids up to 800 megawatts. There's no preferred bid size, but we are looking for to capture some of the efficiencies related both to transmission cabling and the use of onshore transmission interconnection points. The RFP is also the result of an extensive stakeholder engagement process, which led to some important changes that will allow us to build on the Commonwealth's commitment to environmental justice and a diverse, equitable, and inclusive workforce. For the first time, this RFP will require bidders to submit diversity, equity, and inclusion plans that include a workforce diversity plan and supplier diversity program plan, and to track and report on the status of environmental justice impacts, engagement and employment, training, recruitment, and hiring opportunities. This RFP also includes an environmental and socioeconomic impact evaluation, which asks bidders to detail any potential impacts, both positive and negative, including an assessment of cumulative environmental impacts on environmental justice populations and host communities. We're excited about these changes and think this continues to show the evolution of our clean energy procurement process. So we look forward to posting the final bid and receiving these from offshore wind developments. And so, you know, as we move forward, offshore wind is really a critical backbone to our clean energy portfolio to hitting net zero. Next slide, please. Another piece in Senate Bill 9 that will have significant importance and is something we were looking at in our clean energy and climate plan is a new requirement for the Department of Energy Resources to promulgate a strengthened stretch energy code for municipal adoption by November of 2022. This is something to modernize the current stretch code we have which has not been so stretchy. It's been around for a while now, and the technology has improved, and the level of efficiency we need to get out of our homes and buildings is critical to hitting this net zero goal. And we heard a lot of really important feedback from businesses and other groups in the state about the stretch code. And so it was critically important to the governor that this provision would not harm the creation of needed affordable housing throughout the state. This is a critical priority with the housing provisions in the economic development bill coming through, that we continue to really emphasize the importance of creating new affordable housing throughout the Commonwealth. So we worked very hard with the legislature through a series of amendments and conversations to get this new opt-in stretch code to a place where we felt comfortable that it would be supportive of the housing industry and not increasing the cost for residents. So we believe this new stretch code provision in the final bill incorporates that feedback. It provides needed flexibility to businesses, and it allows for significant opportunity for public input during the development of that stretch code. I should note it's a municipal opt-in. It is not a mandatory code. Any city or town can opt into it. It has to be available by November of 2022, as I mentioned. And as our Department of Energy Resources crafts the code, they must hold at least 5 public hearings, key to hearing from all sectors on this code and how it will be deployed and effective. The requirement in the bill aligns with the findings of our 2050 roadmap study and recommendations in the interim 2030 clean energy and climate plan that we released at the end of December to reduce emissions from new construction, the time when energy efficiency upgrades are the most cost effective, resulting in fewer buildings needing retrofits between now and 2050. And so retrofits of our existing building stock are a real challenge. And so this is seeking to ensure that as we're building new buildings, we are taking the opportunity to make them as energy efficient, as tight as we possibly can. Our Department of Energy Resources is also undertaking residential and commercial building studies now, and will be initiating stakeholder engagement and public comments related to this code in the fall, with the goal of finalizing the new specialized stretch energy code in 2022. Next slide, please. As I mentioned, the bill also institutes new appliance energy efficiency standards to reduce the energy usage of appliances we all rely on to make our busy lives a little easier. It adds 15 new products to Massachusetts appliance standards and specifies minimum performance standards. This provision will go into effect in January of next year, and the Department of Energy Resources will be promulgating regulations this year consistent with this change. This bill also made changes to the statewide energy efficiency programs to better align our energy efficiency programs with our emissions goals. And so I will now be setting a greenhouse gas emissions reduction goal for each 3-year energy efficiency plan that is negotiated with the utility providers and others. So the plan, I will then certify that the plan's goals are met and then file that as a report with the legislature. So this places more emphasis, not just on straight up cost, but also on the cost of climate change and the emissions produced. Next slide, please. A big piece of this bill, and I should really emphasize this, is the nation-leading provisions that will help us better protect environmental justice communities. We know that for too long, certain communities in Massachusetts have had to shoulder an undue burden of pollution and environmental impacts because of historic infrastructure. And this bill will begin to reconcile that history by codifying environmental justice into state law and requiring that existing pollution within a community is part of the record when making environmental permitting decisions. Our administration added an amendment to the bill that will require the Department of Environmental Protection for the first time to develop regulations to assess the cumulative impact of energy projects and other projects into the permitting process moving forward. And so we're beginning to develop a stakeholder process this summer to obtain inputs on this permitting process, which should include cumulative impact analysis and the best way to conduct those analyses. Believe it or not, there are not any possibly other states in the country who do this. We are looking for examples, but these sessions will provide regular engagement and updates to the public on this process. And what we mean by cumulative impact here is when our department is providing a permit, they're not just looking at the impacts of that particular piece of infrastructure or energy project, they're looking at the entire pollution burden on a community, which is something we feel very strongly about. The law also established an Environmental Justice Advisory Council, which will advise and provide recommendations to the EEA team on relevant policies and standards to achieve this equitable distribution of energy and environmental benefits and burdens, and provide opportunities for meaningful public involvement so that members of environmental justice populations can assess the impact and influence the outcome of proposed projects that affect their environment, health, and safety in their communities. So we're now in the process of identifying members for this new council and convening the group. Next slide, please. I mentioned in the beginning that we, over the last 2 years, completed a planning effort to look at the pathways to get to net zero by 2050. I'm proud to say that we're the first state in the nation to release a comprehensive study getting us outlining the pathways to achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And so this report that is available on our website looks at these different pathways and the findings from each of them. And it has 6 technical reports detailing analysis across different sectors, from energy supply to land use and economic and health impacts. And so this study is really guiding the development of our shorter term policies to ensure that they are aligned with the longer term goal. Next slide, please. We found through this study that the net zero goal is achievable. We can get there affordably, particularly if we look at replacing things with stock rollover. So when something breaks or reaches the end of its useful life, that's the key moment to transition it to something clean. A key across these pathways was to ensure we could maintain a thriving economy and bring all of our residents along, especially our most vulnerable. And I should really emphasize, our analysis found that in the many pathways we examined, we looked at 8 different pathways, that if we make smart choices, we can actually achieve these net zero emissions in 2050 for about the same cost year on year as we would expect to spend already. Next slide. There were some key findings from this roadmap that are important to guiding the work ahead. I mentioned this earlier, but offshore wind is a really critical piece of any clean energy portfolio. And so that resource anchors our ability to get to 2050. We're looking at least 15 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. We are very close to getting our first 800 megawatts on the grid now, but we'll need to be doing about a project a year starting in the 2030s to get to that level. To connect all of these clean energy resources, we need more interstate transmission to allow us to access renewable generation in other states and Canada. So we have a hydro project right now, a transmission line through Maine, bringing us hydropower. We also need to look for onshore solar and wind in other states. and connecting within the grid is a really important and cost-effective way to get more of this clean energy onto our grid. Obviously, we need to plug in to this clean energy, and so we're looking at widespread electrification of transportation, as well as building heat in certain areas and certain sectors. And then, as I mentioned, a key to doing this cost effectively is looking for the moment when infrastructure is at the end of its useful life and making sure we're replacing it with the clean, green infrastructure of the future. Next slide, please. So we have also been in the process of completing our 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan, which is required under the Global Warming Solutions Act. And the idea was, if we're going to do this right, we really need the long-term outlook to 2050 that would then inform the 10-year plan for this decade. And many of the tenets in the 2050 roadmap are guiding the development of this plan, particularly looking for end-of-life stock turnover moments. We're also focused on supporting innovation through our work at the Department of Energy Resources and through our Massachusetts Clean Energy Center. And we'll need to take advantage of technology breakthroughs and innovations in our own clean tech sector in terms of continuing to bring down costs. This really is the decade for action to sort of turn the ship and make sure that we can hit our ambitious mid-century goals. And we are looking at significant changes across sectors. So our modeling suggests we're looking to retrofit over 1 million homes, support highly efficient new construction through this new building code, and help people adopt clean heating solutions like air source heat pumps. We're also looking at over 750,000 new EVs on the road, as well as achieving a 15% reduction in miles traveled. We'll also need to build and interconnect 6,000 megawatts of clean energy and modernize our electric grid to be able to support the development of these new clean energy resources. So it's certainly not a plan for the faint of heart, but this 2030 Clean Energy and Climate Plan establishes a blueprint for moving towards these goals equitably and affordably, with major new initiatives advancing the decarbonization of the Commonwealth's buildings, transportation, and electricity sectors. Next slide, please. So the framework of this Clean Energy and Climate Plan is very strong, but it is a draft plan at this point. And so we're currently working to develop and finalize the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. And now it has to include a 2025 interim emissions target and a 2030 target, as I mentioned, of at least 50% by July 1st of next summer. So, and this plan will also be updated to comply fully with Senate Bill 9 and incorporate many of the suggestions we received through the public comment process for the interim plan. We are re-examining the portfolio of policies in the interim 2030 CECP and analyzing additional strategies, policies, and actions to help us get to at least 50% emission reductions by 2030. At the same time, protecting and enhancing carbon storage in our natural and working lands, which is a new and very key piece of both the legislation and our Clean Energy and Climate Plan. We will be looking at the costs and benefits of those policies, tracking them, their potential impact on and benefits to environmental justice communities, and measures to track their implementation over time. So key pieces of the planning work going forward. This means this additional year of planning while we're implementing means we will have additional opportunities for engagement, of course, with the legislature, but with stakeholders and members of the public throughout the next year as we update the plan. And as we develop and finalize the 2025 and 2030 CECP, our administration is continuing to implement strategies, policies, and actions outlined in the draft plan, including convening the Commission on Clean Heat starting next month. That commission will be looking at how we make this transition to a decarbonized heating sector and the key policies and strategies to get there. Next slide, please. So I just started in on this, so I won't go too deep into it. Notice, we're getting towards time here, and I want to save time for questions. But this commission will be charged with looking at providing recommendations to the governor around the future of clean heat in the Commonwealth. It's focused on informing, setting long-term declining caps on heating fuel emissions and the development of policies to support that transition to cleaner heating options. We had a commission like this for the future of transportation. I think there are some of you who were involved in that here, but that was a very effective commission in terms of getting recommendations to the governor around that sector. And so this will be very much in that model, with a focus on supporting policies to transition towards this clean heat goal and to meet the cap we've set. And we now have a cap under the Transportation and Climate Initiative for transportation. We have a cap under the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative for the electric sector. This will be capping our third sector, which is the heating space. We're looking for this commission to be convened in May or June, so very soon, and will be supported by an interagency task force made up of staff across our energy agencies. Next slide, please. I did want to mention vehicle electrification quickly and some of the opportunities we have now. Many of you are familiar with how big a deal transportation emissions are in the Commonwealth. It's true not just here, across the Northeast and really across the country. Our transportation sector emissions make up about 40% of our overall emissions. As we've brought down emissions in the power sector, we've continued to see transportation emissions grow. And so to encourage electric vehicle adoption, our Department of Energy Resources reinstated the Commonwealth's electric vehicle rebate program, More EV, beginning in January of 2020 and lasting through at least next December. We did see a slowdown in the use of this rebate program during particularly the early days of the pandemic, as you might imagine. So we have been able to expand our rebate eligibility to include trucks as well as commercial and nonprofit fleets, and targeted these incentives to improve equity. Last month, we announced a new program at the Massachusetts Clean Energy Center to support fleet managers as they plan for and procure medium and heavy duty electric vehicle fleets. So this is what we're calling our Fleet Advisory Program, and it provides pathways for businesses to plan for and procure these medium and heavy duty electric vehicles, which are not always, it's not always straightforward. What infrastructure do you need on site to manage a fleet like this? Where do you go to buy it? What do you need to know? And so Mass CEC is retaining a consultant who has expertise in these types of fleets and planning to recruit privately owned fleets and provide them with electrification analyses and procurement assistance in terms of making these goals a reality. And then back in December, of course, Governor Baker joined the leaders of Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Washington, D.C. in signing an MOU committing to the groundbreaking multi-state transportation and climate initiative program, which we call TCIP. So this program is really critical to our transportation decarbonization efforts going forward. It will reduce motor vehicle pollution by at least 26% by 2030, by 2032, and generate $1.8 billion in Massachusetts for investments in cleaner, more equitable and affordable transportation. Next slide, please. And then finally, I did want to mention climate adaptation, which is a big piece of the work we're doing. And so while reducing emissions and mitigating the impacts of climate change is central to our overall climate strategy, we also know that climate change impacts are already happening now and impacting cities and towns across the Commonwealth. And while this climate bill was needed to mitigate the impacts of climate change, it did not address our ability to adapt to these increasingly severe impacts. We have pulled in many communities on this through our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, which helps cities and towns plan for and adapt to climate change. And this has continued to grow exponentially since it was first announced back in 2017. We now have 89% of communities enrolled. We've given out 44 million awarded to date. Our last round of action grants just closed, well oversubscribed. So we are really looking to find ways to build out this program. It started very small with a $1 million dedicated stream for planning grants, and now we've built it up to this size where it's a tremendous opportunity to provide cities and towns with the resilient infrastructure they need in the future. So we're at the point now where 312 out of 351 are participating in the program, and demand is continuing to grow. And so we are looking at ways to develop a dedicated, significant, and sustainable funding source to prepare the Commonwealth for the impacts of climate change. A few years ago, the governor filed our Resilient Massachusetts legislation, Senate Bill 10. This did not move out of committee, but this session we are working with partners and with the legislature to file new legislation to achieve similar goals. We've also rolled out a climate resilience design standards tool, which is an interactive web-based platform that provides preliminary climate change risk screening. So looking at the risk and vulnerability of different structures across the state and recommended resilience design standards for projects, particularly those applying for state funding. We're testing the tool right now in a beta format with our MVP program, with the MassWorks infrastructure program, and looking at our MEPA program as well. So we're requesting feedback on this tool and really look forward to hearing from folks who are on the ground using it. So for those of you who are interested, great tool to check out, and we can provide links to it. So next slide, which is just a thank you, but as you can see, we really have a lot of work ahead of us as we begin to implement this groundbreaking new climate law and continue working across our administration and in partnership with the legislature on all of our efforts to combat climate change. And so we really look forward to continued partnership with you on these important initiatives. We wouldn't be able to succeed at the work we do without the collaboration and leadership of so many businesses here in Massachusetts that are really leading the nation in prioritizing making their operations more sustainable and reducing their carbon footprint. So thank you. Look forward to some discussion now. And just again, a real thank you for having me here today.
Well, thank you, Secretary, for an excellent presentation. You covered a lot of ground in a very short amount of time. We are excited to turn to questions now, and certainly I invite our audience members to utilize the Q&A function to submit questions. Secretary, I want to start out with a question actually about carbon sequestration. Obviously, carbon sequestration is a part of the plan. Before you, wondering if you can expand on a little bit, what does that look like? What is our capacity for that? And actually from a technology perspective, do you think there might be opportunity for Massachusetts companies to participate in that effort?
So carbon sequestration is something that until now, both with the legislation and with our 2030 clean energy and climate plan and our net zero goal, had not been something we were tracking at a state scale. But a state like Massachusetts, like many New England states, is heavily forested, still has a good base of working farmland, and has this opportunity to sequester carbon in these natural and working land spaces. And so what we're doing first here is creating an inventory so we can track carbon, looking at programs that have been designed to capture carbon credits for permanently protecting additional farms and forest lands in a way that sequesters carbon, also implementing practices in terms of sustainable management on land that is currently used for forestry. So this is a program, the idea of sequestering carbon is not just that you have to have a forest and lock it up and never do anything with it, but if you're going to have a working forest or a working farmland, that you're following certain practices to ensure that while these are in active production, they're also sequestering carbon over the long term. At the same time, I think there is the opportunity for new technologies like carbon capture and sequestration to play a role across the country and here in Massachusetts. They've not come to the scale yet where they're extremely economically viable or widespread, but the feds are beginning to invest in these technologies in a real way. And so I do think there may be opportunities in the future.
Excellent, thank you. Moving on to some audience questions. Wondering if you can expand a bit on incentives for individuals and companies to move to clean energy. And obviously, certainly I'd welcome you here to talk about any EEA programs that are not explicitly connected with this piece of legislation.
Sure. So we have, any number of, there's a lawnmower outside, closing my window. We have any number of incentive programs for different clean energy technologies. Obviously, all of the Mass Save programs are available for homes and business. Free energy audit. Right now, insulation is 100% covered. So that's something if folks have not had the opportunity to get an audit and get their house or business super efficient, really good opportunity right now coming out of the pandemic to get super energy efficient. I mentioned the transportation incentives around both medium and heavy duty, which is a brand new opportunity and one we really encourage businesses to look into. If you have a fleet, can we help you transition your fleet to brand new electric vehicles? And can we actually help you get a fleet manager in to help you do it? Because as I mentioned, not straightforward. But also for light duty vehicles, we continue to have those more EV rebates. We also have an incentive program for EV charging infrastructure at Mass DEP. We have a heat pump program at the Clean Energy Center and are looking for ways to ramp up the deployment of heat pumps now through our 3-year energy efficiency plan. And then, of course, there's any number of a grab bag of programs that are basically incentive programs through CACs and RECs and CPECs, our clean energy credit programs. So our Clean Peak Standard, the RPS, the Clean Energy Standard. If you're in the energy producing business, those are all credits and economic benefits that could flow to your business.
Certainly, thank you. And moving on with the questions, we've got some great ones here. Will permit reviews also consider the total pollution burden on communities that are not EJ or environmental justice communities? Obviously, there's a lot of projects going on across the state. And actually, as a related matter, I'm wondering if you might elaborate on at this point how the definition of an environmental justice community versus one that would not be considered as such.
Yeah, so to the first question, we are definitely starting with the cumulative impact piece, looking at environmental justice communities, because there is a cumulative impact of harm in those communities in terms of pollution. I suspect the framework would allow us to look at a wider scope of communities in the future, but we will certainly be starting with communities that are defined as environmental justice communities. And I don't have the exact new definition in front of me that's in the legislation, so I don't want to get it wrong. But the three aspects of defining environmental justice communities are communities with significant low-income populations, minority populations, and then non-English speaking populations. So that's I just won't give the exact numbers, but I can send that around afterwards.
Certainly, and understood, and thank you for that. And another question that gets to the fact that obviously construction projects certainly may be underway before the adoption of a future stretch code. And obviously, buildings constructed now may be subject to future requirements. Can you elaborate a little bit on communications efforts from EEA to developers, to folks who might be later subject to further developing standards, who might be looking to do projects now, maybe things that were delayed during the pandemic? Obviously, as you alluded to, the administration has been doing a lot to encourage housing construction. What types of communications might be done to developers now, understanding that the specifics of future stretch codes might be a few years down the road?
So we are definitely looking for ways to get the word out about the development of the new stretch code itself. We really want input, particularly from the building and construction and development community. So as we set up these 5 meetings in the fall, we will be reaching out to various trade groups and just publicly to make sure we get significant input from the building sector. I should mention, though, this new stretch code is a municipal opt-in code. And so it will be up to individual municipalities whether or not they adopt that code in November of 2022. And so there will be, I imagine we will be putting up maps of who's adopted it and who hasn't, sort of as our Green Communities program has worked with the existing stretch code. So making that available to the public in terms of knowing what the rules of the road are in their community will be an important piece of this.
And certainly, and sticking perhaps with the theme of engagement, obviously we just touched on the business community. Wondering if you might talk a little bit about the process for engagement with municipalities. Obviously, municipalities are going to be a big part of implementing any plan like this. As you alluded to, municipalities would have the option to adopt a stretch code. Certainly our audience today, a lot of municipal officials. Wondering if you might talk about how that might proceed.
So, I think the same thing again with these workshops in the fall, really looking for lessons learned through communities that are currently using the existing stretch code, what they've liked, what they haven't liked, what some of their concerns are around a new stretch code. I think one of the priorities of the governor and lieutenant governors is always working hand in hand with our local partners, and all of our best programs in the state have been designed in that way, whether it's MVP or Green Communities or our Community Compact program that's administration wide. So we will absolutely be looking for input from locals around the best way to both to build this building code or to develop this building code, but also to deploy it.
And a question in the chat related also to municipalities, but specific to electronic vehicles. Could you talk about what programs that might be available? The questioner references specifically police vehicles and heavier trucks from Public Works to help them move to electronic vehicles. I actually, and certainly again, here we'll invite you not necessarily to stick to the legislation, but I know that there might be some other programming to the Commonwealth to assist cities and towns with efforts like that. So I'm wondering if you might touch on some of those available options.
I believe our Green Communities program covers fleets. So if you are not a Green Communities, well, if you are, that is one place to look. If you're not, it's also something that may be worth signing up for. And then I have to check if our new fleet rebate covers municipal fleets, but I don't see why it wouldn't. Just that's something I would have to get back on.
Excellent.
But we do believe that many of the fleets that exist now, whether they're police or in our case, we have a lot of heavy duty vehicles within EEA fleets, also MBTA, there's a variety of different sort of specialized vehicle types we have now. And with the rapid sort of diversification of EV options, we think there is a viable EV for most every situation. And so looking to deploy them through incentives is really something we're very focused on right now.
Certainly. A question regarding the Mass Save program. So the draft 2030 CECP utilizes the Mass Save program as a mechanism to encourage improvements. Obviously, there are certain municipalities in Massachusetts, including 6 here in the partnership service area, who are served by municipal electric companies and don't participate in the Mass Save program. Is some sort of alternative approach going to be carved out for those communities?
We have not had sort of a larger discussion with MLPs about something like that, but I think that would certainly be something that is of interest to us. We are also looking at ways to allow MLPs to opt into some of our programs, like the Clean Peak Standard, which is a new program, particularly looking to deploy storage and other renewable resources at times of peak use. Some of these changes require legislative changes, but I think this is something we will be looking at going forward.
Excellent, thank you. A question also related to carbon sequestration and understanding it. It might be a bit early in the process to answer this, but a questioner wondering if the administration might be considering or working towards direct incentives for properties kept in agriculture or forestry for those purposes as part of the carbon sequestration approach.
So we have a lot of incentive programs now for active farmland and forest land, whether it's our Chapter 61 program that provides a tax benefit for keeping your land in working farm and forest. That's obviously not based on the carbon value of the landscape. It's based on the value of keeping it either as, in agricultural land, because once it's out of agricultural land, there's usually no way to go back, or to keep it for active open space or recreational purposes. So there are a number of existing programs, also the tax benefits from putting a conservation restriction on your property. But yes, we absolutely are looking at ways to, in addition to sort of the existing suite of open space and conservation incentive programs we have, are there also incentives we could be giving property owners for the carbon that is stored on their lands? So that's an active area of exploration right now for us, particularly coming out of this new requirement in the legislation and new inventory in our clean energy and climate plan.
Excellent, thank you. Specific to HVAC systems, we have another question. I think that gets back to the topic of communication with the business community. So we have a questioner who finds that vendors or installers or HVAC professionals, the questioner is saying that they might not always be the most current. Are there any communication plans specific to professionals, whether they be HVAC professionals or professionals who focus on heating, ventilation, systems like that could obviously have a direct bearing on this to provide them with the latest information?
So one of the things we are looking at is the education, the workforce education that's needed if we're serious about significant electrification of the heating space. We think it's a real opportunity, both to create new clean energy jobs, but also to transition folks, from current work to new work. And so this is something we're looking at we'll be looking at both through the Commission on the Future of Clean Heat, what the workforce development and educational opportunities are, and then through our programming at the Department of Energy Resources and our work with Mass Save, how can we ensure, particularly with Mass Save, that the providers who are going around to people's homes are up to speed on all of the latest technology that's available. Heat pumps have really matured in terms of their viability and economics. And so just getting the workforce significantly up to speed on all of those opportunities is something we're taking a real look into right now.
Thank you. Another question from the audience regarding transmission lines and infrastructure. And the questioner stipulates that they're seeing that electricity providers in the state might be struggling to keep up with solar installation and accepting back electricity to the grid. They consider the process to be slow. What are your thoughts on this situation?
It is slow right now. I won't argue with that, and it's a challenge that I think extends not just to our solar program, but to all of the clean energy resources that are coming into the grid, and not just our distribution grid, but also the larger scale transmission grid. And so the investments in our distribution system, the investments in our transmission system going forward to take all of this clean energy and connect it to residents across the state are going to be significant. And so some of what we're doing right now is working with the regional system operator, the ISO that's out in Holyoke, to understand how we can procure more clean energy through these existing regional markets, but also how they can help the states plan for better grid integration. So that's a sort of a high level piece. Obviously on the solar front, our DPU is doing work on a solar cluster study right now that's coming out very soon, related directly to the interconnection of these resources onto the grid. But something we did in the SMART program revision that happened last summer was to start directing incentives away from greenfield solar, particularly where that greenfield had important ecological or habitat benefits. And one of the interesting sort of side effects of that is that we're now directing incentives for solar to areas where there is more demand on the grid for energy. Doing all of these greenfield solar developments actually had sort of the unintended consequence of putting solar in places where there was no load. And so that caused significant interconnection challenges, particularly in Western and Central Massachusetts. And so by redirecting solar through the incentives back to areas that are more developed, have more demand, we should be seeing somewhat less challenges in terms of interconnection. But this is a big challenge, and it's something we're working on a number of fronts.
Thank you. Secretary, we're going to take two more questions before we invite you to make some closing comments. A question from an audience member who's also a municipal official regarding climate exposure and risks ratings report. The official notes that there was a small sidewalk project that resulted in a high risk rating, and wondering if some sort of allowance might be made for scale of project, whereas the size of a project getting a high risk rating, if it was a larger project versus something that was more along the lines of, in this case, the questioner is stipulating was a modest sidewalk improvement.
And was this using the tool that I mentioned?
I believe so, yes. And I'd invite the questioner to throw in some additional detail if she'd like.
Okay. Well, I'd love to have our climate team look at this more specifically and maybe troubleshoot, because the tool is actually supposed to be based on, first, before you actually get into assessing the exposure from climate impacts, the lifespan, criticality of the resource, and the population it serves. So obviously a sidewalk is not very critical, does not serve a vulnerable population necessarily in a large way necessarily. So those pieces are supposed to be part of the tool, and if they're not showing up in the analysis, that may be either a malfunction or a lack of information. But we'd be happy to troubleshoot that. That's exactly the kind of thing we're looking for, though. Is like a small sidewalk should the lifespan of a sidewalk. I don't know. I don't think it's very long, but it shouldn't trigger sort of the level of risk, additional risk tolerance that would be required for something like a healthcare facility or an emergency shelter or something like that.
Understood, certainly. And I'd invite the questioner to drop me a line at jason@495.org, and we can get
We'd be happy to troubleshoot that one with you.
Excellent, Secretary. And sort of a closing question for you. And obviously this legislation, it's not an economic development bill, it's focused on climate, but I'm curious to get your thoughts on its relationship to workforce development in the Commonwealth. Obviously, Massachusetts is a state with a lot of high technology. Clean energy companies are certainly very successful here. What relationship do you see this new approach to workforce development, to job growth in the Commonwealth?
Well, this is a great question to close on. I really do look at our clean energy future, our resiliency future as a jobs creator, whether it's the offshore wind industry and just, this one Vineyard Wind project with the potential for 3,600 new jobs, just really in construction and operations. But if you look at that expanding to economic development all throughout the state to support clean energy and the new training and technology and innovation that's going to bring, I do see this going hand in hand with an economic recovery coming out of this pandemic. These are new, good, highly skilled jobs at every level. And whether you're looking at resiliency and sort of new infrastructure construction, planning, training, working with municipalities, great jobs in the climate resiliency space, shovel-ready projects throughout all of our communities right now, and also significant opportunity from the federal government if they get this infrastructure built through to pull in dollars for local communities while creating new jobs. And on the clean energy side, I think it's much the same. It's installing EV chargers and charging corridors up and down the state. It's deploying new vehicles. It's investing in our grid infrastructure and figuring out heat pumps and going into 1 million houses across the state to make them super energy efficient. So I think this is all a real opportunity for jobs, for economic growth, and for innovation, which is something that Massachusetts just happens to be very good at. So I'm excited about the opportunities ahead, and really excited to work with groups like yours to keep talking about the business opportunities.
Well, Secretary, I want to thank you, and I'll invite you to make some brief closing remarks, but I'm going to kind of sneak attack with a little bit of another question there.
No, that was a good one to end on, but I'll go for another.
if you might, in your closing remarks, maybe
Yeah.
touch a little bit on future public engagement. You've alluded to this at several points during the presentation, but obviously we have folks from the business community, municipal officials who have further questions, further comments. So if you might just retouch on some of those points, where obviously there's a lot of decisions yet to be made as they relate to this legislation. So if you might close a little bit on touching on some of those opportunities in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, as I mentioned earlier, all of the strength of our climate programs, our environment and energy programs comes from our work with municipalities, businesses, residents, and other stakeholders across the Commonwealth, and of course the legislature. And so, your continued partnership and involvement as we build out this new clean energy and climate resilient future is very important to me, to Governor Baker, to Lieutenant Governor Polito. We want a very active and engaged discussion moving forward, and some key opportunities coming soon. This Future of Clean Heat Commission, it will have a number of folks on it, but we will be talking to many stakeholders throughout the commission process. The new building code, as I mentioned, 5 opportunities for engagement, either in person or virtually in the fall, but also a significant comment period. We will be taking significant public engagement and stakeholdering through the development of the Clean Energy and Climate Plan. We just released a sort of the overview of the schedule for that, but we can send this group specific meeting dates. That's going to be a key piece of moving all of these policies forward and implementing the legislation. And then the other one that comes to mind in a big way is as we move forward on getting new climate resiliency legislation drafted, we would look to groups like this for input around the best ways to deploy something like that at a meaningful scale across the state. So that's a snapshot. We have lots more, including our 3-year energy efficiency plan, which is actively being discussed right now. But I think those are some of the major initiatives going forward.
Well, Secretary, thank you. And I want to thank you for your time today on behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership. This was a very insightful presentation. As you've touched on several times, we know that this is a process that's going to involve continuous stakeholder engagement for quite a while. So we will do our best as an organization to make sure our stakeholders are kept up to speed with where they can participate in this process. We want to thank you again for your time. I want to thank all of our audience members for their participation this morning. A recording of today's presentation will be available later today on 495partnership.org. And if you're interested in keeping up to speed with our events and activities, please be sure to join our email list, which you can do at 495partnership.org under the Get Involved tab. So on behalf of the 495 MetroWest Partnership, I want to thank everyone for your participation today and have a great day.
Thank you all.